I was leaned into a secondary panel with one glove off, checking a bad branch line and tightening down a loose terminal when the knocking started again in the water pipe behind the wall. I tried to ignore it. Old houses made noise, pressure shifted, metal popped. That was what I told myself. Then I turned the screwdriver once, twice, and the knocking came back in the exact same rhythm. I stopped. It stopped. I moved my hand again, slower this time, and it answered me like it had been waiting for me to set the pace. About 3 seconds later, a light came on at the far end of the corridor. I hadn't touched a switch. I looked up and saw the black pipe running over that hall. That should have been the moment I walked out for good. But to explain why I didn't, I have to go back to the start of that afternoon. I got the call a little before noon and turned onto the old county road outside Poughkeepsie around 1 p.m., with the sky doing that Hudson Valley thing where it was technically bright out, but still felt cold and colorless, not raining, not foggy, just a flat gray light over everything that made the bare trees and stone walls look older than they probably were. My van heater had been stuck between too hot and not doing much for the last month, so I drove the last stretch with one hand on the wheel and the other shoved under my left arm, trying to keep feeling in my fingers before I had to start working. Blackmir Estate sat a long way off the road behind an iron gate and a gravel drive that curved just enough to keep the whole place from showing itself at once. By the time I got up to the front, I could tell what it was right away. Not a showpiece, not one of those houses people built just to make sure the neighbors hated them. This was older money than that. Big stone exterior, tall windows, copper gutters gone dark with age, a main section people still used, and at least one wing that looked like it had been shut up for years without being abandoned enough to fall apart. It felt maintained. That was part of what bothered me later. Houses that have really been left alone rot in a different way. This one still had people keeping it alive. I parked off to the side near a service entrance and sat there for a second with the van idling. I'd been doing that more lately before jobs, just taking a breath and running the numbers again, even when I already knew them. Gas, motel, food, deposit money, how much I had left to put together before I could get out of New York and head down to North Carolina. I was close enough for it to feel real, and not close enough for me to relax. Jobs like that were the worst kind. You start telling yourself every ugly call's the last ugly call you need, and then you keep taking them because you're still a little short. Philip Morrow was waiting for me before I even got the tool bag out. He had that look some men get when they've spent years managing other people's property and are used to opening doors before anyone asks. Late 60s, maybe. Neat coat, gloves in one hand. Calm in a way that didn't read relaxed so much as practiced. He didn't waste time with small talk. He brought me in through the occupied side of the house, and I could tell right away where the line was between the part people actually lived in and the part the house still carried behind itself. The main rooms were warm, lit, clean in that old polished way. Past the entry hall, one section sat darker than it should have in the middle of the day, not blacked out, just underlit, like the power there was trying to hold steady and not quite managing it. Philip looked toward the darker wing across the entry hall. "I need that section stable before tomorrow," he said. I followed his eyes across the hall. A chandelier farther in had a weak little flicker in two of the bulbs, not enough to fail, just enough to make you notice if you did this for a living. He explained that Mrs. Eleanor Wren had been away for a few days and would be back the next morning. There was going to be a small gathering not long after. Nothing major, the way he said it. But that didn't matter. In houses like that, anything involving guests became urgent fast. A dining room feed, service lighting, kitchen sub-circuits, climate controls in one wing. It all had to behave when the owner came home. I asked where the main trouble was feeding from. "Basement level," he said, "the older service side." That made sense. Bigger old estates almost always had some buried backbone running through places no one wanted to think about. Old panels, old junction boxes, dead-end lines no one had fully removed because once a house had been rewired 2 or 3 times, nobody trusted what was really dead anymore. He took me through a narrower hall off the backside of the first floor, where the trim got simpler and the flooring changed under my boots. Less house, more function. There was a locked door at the end, painted over enough times that the edges had gone thick. Philip already had the basement key in his hand. That stuck with me. Not because it was strange for a butler to have keys, because he had that one ready before I'd even asked to see the panel. He said that part of the house wasn't used anymore, and he said it too smoothly, like it was an answer he'd given more than once and had long since stopped hearing himself say. Before he handed me the key, he held it a second longer. "There are a few things I need you to do exactly the way I say them," he said. I didn't go straight for the basement after that. If a house is giving you weak light in one wing, a couple of dead outlets, and intermittent drop on a line that's still technically live, you don't start by chasing ghosts in the walls. You start with the easy stuff. You check what's in front of you. You make sure the problem is actually in the system and not just one bad fixture, one failed switch leg, one outlet somebody backstabbed 20 years ago and forgot about. I set my bag down in the darker wing and started moving room to room. It was mostly sitting rooms, a long dining space, and a stretch of hallway that tied back toward what looked like a service pantry and a smaller rear stair. A few lamps were already unplugged and moved aside like somebody had been trying to narrow it down before I got there. I checked the nearest receptacles first. 2 were dead. The third read low, then came back up a second later. Not enough to hold steady, just enough to tell me the line was still trying. The overhead fixtures were worse in a different way. They didn't fail clean. They dipped. A wall sconce in the hall went weak for half a second and then came back like it had caught itself. The chandelier in the dining room did the same thing, only in 2 bulbs, not all of them. That mattered. If the fixture was failing, you usually got a cleaner symptom. Loose neutral upstream, tired connection on a feed, maybe an old splice heating up somewhere it shouldn't. That was where my head went first. I opened the first wall plate and checked the device. Nothing dramatic, old but not crumbling, tight enough. I moved to the panel serving that side of the house and pulled the dead front. No obvious burn marks, no tripped breaker. I checked voltage line to neutral, then line to ground, then started cycling load the slow way, one branch at a time, watching for drift. The reading dipped when it shouldn't have on one lighting circuit, and again on what looked like a secondary receptacle run. Different labels, same behavior. That was what pushed it past a fixture problem for me. I traced the labels, followed what I could, then found where the newer work stopped looking new, and the handwriting on the panel schedule changed. That happened in old places. A clean update for 1 decade, sitting right next to something older, somebody had only half documented because they assumed the next guy would figure it out. The circuits feeding the occupied wing had been tied into something older, farther back. Not wrong, exactly, just layered. Houses like that always ended up layered. I went back through the wing one more time and checked the outlets Philip had mentioned. Same pattern, one dead, one weak, one fine until I put a load on it. Then it sagged and recovered late. That late recovery got under my skin more than it should have, not because it was spooky, just because it was annoying. Systems usually tell you what's wrong if you stay patient long enough. This one felt like it was lagging behind itself. I closed the panel, stood up, and rolled my shoulders out. My shirt was already sticking a little between my shoulder blades under the work jacket. Old houses did that. They could be cold in the room and still make you sweat once you started opening walls and panels, in and out of kneeling, getting back up, dragging your bag from one corner to the next. I'd been doing jobs like that for months. Bigger houses, worse calls, people who waited too long to bring somebody in because they hoped the issue would straighten itself out. then acted surprised when it got expensive. I took them because they paid more than clean jobs and because every ugly call got me a little closer to leaving. I was tired enough by then that I didn't really dress that thought up anymore. It was just numbers, how much I had, how much I still needed, gas to get out, first month somewhere else, deposit if I found a place fast, a few nights covered if I didn't. North Carolina sat in my head like a place I'd already started driving toward, even when I was still in New York taking one more call. I checked the service notes I'd scribbled for myself, looked back toward the darker end of the hall, and knew I was done pretending the problem might be upstairs. "It's not the fixtures upstairs," I said. "Something's wrong farther down the line." Philip stood in the doorway to the service hall. "That's what I was afraid of," he said. He didn't sound dramatic about it. No pause for effect. No look that said he'd been waiting to hear exactly that. Just tired in a way that matched the house. Like he already had a list in his head of what had to be handled before tomorrow. And this was one more thing settling into the place he expected it to land. I crouched by my open bag and swapped out a couple of tools. I took the clamp meter, a stronger flashlight, extra gloves, and a second screwdriver I liked better for older terminal screws because the grip was worn in the right way. If the feed issue was down below, I wanted everything on me the first trip. I didn't like making extra runs once I got into a service basement. Too many narrow spaces, too many places to set something down and waste time going back for it. There was still nothing about the job itself that felt impossible. Annoying, yes. Buried deeper than I liked, sure, but still work. Still wiring, panels, junctions, feeder path, failure point. Something I could trace if the house would just hold still long enough to let me. As I picked up my tool bag, he said, "Then you should hear the rest before you go below." Philip took me through the service hall and stopped at the painted-over door at the end. Up close, it looked older than the rest of that side of the house, not because the wood was falling apart, but because people had kept covering it instead of replacing it. The paint had built up thick around the frame and split near the latch. The brass plate under the knob had gone dull in a way you only got from years of hands and polish and then long stretches without either one. There was a small ceiling light over the door, giving off a weak electrical hum, not flickering, just old enough to remind you it was there. He still had the key in his hand. The second he opened the door, the air changed. Not colder exactly. Wetter. The smell came first. Stone, mildew, old dust, and that mineral damp you got in basements that had spent too many winters keeping the same secrets to themselves. A narrow stairwell dropped away in front of us. The walls were rough block and old plaster, patched in places and sweating faintly in others. Daylight from the hall behind us made it down maybe 6 or 7 steps before it just gave up. Past that, the stairwell folded into its own darker air. Philip kept the key in his hand before opening the door. "Once you're down there, don't rush," he said. I shifted the weight of the tool bag higher on my shoulder and looked past him down the steps. Nothing about it looked impossible. Just old. I'd worked in worse places than that. Crawl spaces with dead raccoons in the insulation, boiler rooms with standing water and live metal 2 feet apart, apartment basements where nobody had labeled anything since Reagan. This was cleaner than some of those. Bigger, too. The kind of service space rich houses ended up with because everything had been added, updated, extended, or sealed off 1 decade at a time. There was a pull cord hanging just inside the lower landing where the daylight cut off. He pointed to the hanging light cord. "Pull that once, no more than once," he said. I looked at the cord, then at him. That was the first moment I started thinking this house might have the kind of rules people stop questioning after they've lived with them too long. Philip didn't look embarrassed saying it, though. That was the part that kept me from rolling my eyes. He stepped aside enough to let me see farther down. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened into more than one direction. I could make out a main corridor and another splitting off beyond it. Pipes ran the ceiling in neat lines, some newer copper, some older metal painted years back and left that way. One line overhead had been painted red. Farther back, another ran dark enough to read almost black in the low light. He glanced up the corridor. "You stay with the red pipe," he said. That got more of a reaction out of me than the light cord had, though I kept it to myself. It was specific in a way that made it sound either important or ridiculous. Maybe both. I looked again. The red-painted line followed the wider corridor toward what looked like the first service panel and maybe a pump room farther in. The darker one crossed off toward a narrower hall that bent out of sight. If he'd just said the right side was clear and the other side wasn't, I would have taken it as simple direction. The way he phrased it made it sound like the color mattered. He went on before I could ask. "If you hear knocking in the water lines, you leave it alone," he said. That one almost got a laugh out of me. Almost. Not because it was funny. Because it was so specific I didn't know what else to do with it. Every old building made pipe noise. You opened a valve upstairs, heat shifted, pressure moved, something knocked somewhere. I'd spent enough time in old service spaces to stop noticing half of it unless it was tied to a real fault. Hearing him say it like that, though, with no explanation attached, made the hair on the back of my neck lift a little before I could help it. I told myself that was just the air change and the smell. He had a folded service map on a clipboard leaning against the door frame. The paper was yellowed and softened at the edges from being handled too many times. He opened it and showed me the basement layout in the way somebody would show you a fire exit path. Panels marked, utility lines, a couple of older rooms boxed off without much detail. There was a note in one corner written in faded pencil that had been gone over later in darker ink. I couldn't make out all of it from where I stood. He tapped the edge of the old panel map. "There's one breaker with no label. You do not touch it," he said. That was finally enough to make me look straight at him instead of the basement. I looked at him. "You tell every electrician this?" I asked. Philip did not change expression. "I tell the ones I want to finish the day," he said. I didn't believe him. Not really. What I believed was that he believed what he was saying, and those were two different things. So I listened. He walked me through the rest without making it sound like a speech. If I stepped into the corridor under the black pipe by mistake, I was supposed to stop, close my eyes, and step back 3 times before looking again. If the knocking in the pipes ever started matching the rhythm of whatever my hands were doing, I had to stop moving for 5 seconds and not try to outrun it. If the unlabeled breaker ever clicked or dropped on its own, I wasn't to touch it. I was supposed to call him and keep facing the panel until he got there. If the basement door closed while I was still down there, I was to finish the first panel task before coming back to the stairs, and if I heard my name on the way up, I was not supposed to answer it. The whole time he said it, he kept his voice at the same level he'd used upstairs, talking about unstable lines and tomorrow's guests. No drama, no lean-in, no pause waiting for me to react. That got under my skin more than the content did. People trying to scare you usually wanted you to know they were doing it. Philip sounded like a man telling me where the shutoff was. I looked past him one more time down the stairwell. I could smell wet stone and old copper. Somewhere below, water ticked once in a pipe and settled. I still had a live problem to trace, a service wing that needed power by the next day, and a job that, from where I stood, still looked like something a meter and enough patience could solve. Weird instructions were still just weird instructions. Rich house nonsense was still nonsense. That was what I told myself anyway. I adjusted my grip on the bag and set one boot on the first step. Before I stepped onto the first stair, he added, "If something answers your hands, stop moving before it learns the rest of you." The stairs were narrower than they'd looked from the top. My bag brushed the wall twice on the way down, and by the time I hit the lower landing, the smell had settled in for real. Wet stone, Old paint, dust that had been left alone too long, and that metal water smell that lives in service spaces where the pipes sweat year-round. The pull cord hung where Philip had said it would, just off to the right. I reached for it, gave it one pull, and nothing happened. That should have been normal. Old light, old switch, lag in the line, a bulb taking a second to catch. I knew all that. Still, standing there in the dark with one hand still half lifted from the cord, I hated how long that second felt. I counted it off in my head without meaning to. 1, 2. Then the light came on with a weak hum and a sick yellow wash that pushed the dark back just enough to show me more basement and not enough to make any of it feel better. The main corridor ran ahead under the red pipe. The concrete floor had been painted at some point, gray over older gray, and worn through in the center where people had walked it for years before mostly stopping. There were utility doors, shut valve cabinets, and old sink basins stained dark around the drain. And farther down, the first panel mounted against a cinder block wall with conduit fanning out from both sides. Off to the left, deeper in, I could see where another corridor cut away under the darker pipe. Even from where I stood, that one looked tighter, lower, like the air over there didn't move the same. I kept to the red pipe and set my bag down at the first panel. The cover screws fought me a little, the way older ones do when they've had one too many coats of paint over them, but the panel itself opened clean. Inside wasn't as bad as I'd expected. Dust, old labels, some updates done at different times by different hands, nothing immediately burned, nothing obviously dead. I clipped the meter on, checked line voltage, then started tracing the branch that was supposed to be feeding the weak section upstairs. The numbers were off, but not in a way I couldn't argue with yet. Voltage would hold, then sag a little under load, then come back late. Not a hard drop. More like the line had to think about it. I checked the breaker seating, the terminal screws, then moved one branch over to compare. Same thing, only less. That told me the issue was probably farther back, feeder side, junction, something older carrying more than it wanted to. I was writing a quick note on the back of an old service tag when I heard the first knock. Not loud, just one hollow tap somewhere in the plumbing behind the wall to my right. I kept working. A few seconds later, it came again. 2 knocks this time, farther back in the line, like water had moved through a bend and pushed a little air with it. That was enough for me to glance up, but not enough to stop. Pipes knocked. Every old house did it. Heat changed, pressure shifted. Somebody upstairs used a sink. A valve somewhere didn't seat right. It didn't mean anything yet. I tightened one terminal screw and heard 1 knock. I moved to the next and got 2. That was when I looked up toward the low ceiling. "Old pipes," I said. My own voice sounded flatter than I wanted it to. The corridor took it and gave it back softer. I set the screwdriver on the 3rd screw and turned it slow on purpose, watching my hand more than the panel now. Knock. I stopped. Nothing answered me, but the knocking stopped when my hand stopped. I stayed like that for a second, crouched in front of the panel with one knee starting to ache against the concrete. Then I tried again, slower this time. 1 turn, 1 knock, half turn, half beat later, another. It wasn't clean enough to call exact, and that was what let me stay there. If it had been perfect right away, I probably would have backed off sooner, but it was close. Close enough to get under my skin, not close enough to make explanation impossible. I forced myself to count to 5 the way Philip had told me. Not because I believed him, because once something gets in your head on a job, sometimes the fastest way past it is to do the stupid little thing and prove to yourself it doesn't matter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, nothing. Then I went back to the panel, kept my hand slower, and told myself what any electrician would tell himself. Pipe vibration, structure carry, sound moving through old walls, me being alone in a basement and hearing too much at once. The house was old, The service lines were old. The place had probably been modified 10 different ways over 80 or 100 years. It didn't need to be anything stranger than that. Still, after a couple more checks, I realized I wanted my second meter and the other flashlight. Not because I needed both yet, because going back up for them gave me a reason to break the feeling for a minute. I closed the panel, marked my place, and headed back up the stairs. The air in the hall outside felt dry by comparison. Warmer, too. Philip was waiting near the top of the steps with his hands folded in front of him, like he hadn't moved much since I'd gone down. When I came back up for another meter, Philip asked from the top of the stairs, "You still all right?" I did not want to hear how thin my own voice sounded. "Yeah," I said, "just old wiring." That wasn't even a lie, not entirely. I crouched by the open side door, where I'd left part of my gear in the van, and reached in for the second meter case. While I was leaning in, I heard a faint little tick from somewhere toward the rear panel of the van. So light I could have called it cooling metal, or one of the loose sockets in the tool organizer settling. I paused with my hand on the case, listened for it again, and got nothing. Daylight was still coming through the side yard in that flat gray way. The gravel looked normal. The trees beyond the drive moved a little in the wind, and I felt stupid standing there listening to my own van like it had done something. So I shut the door harder than I needed to and went back inside. Philip kept his eyes on the darkness behind me. "Finish the first panel before you move deeper," he said. I nodded, went back down, and returned to the same panel under the red pipe. The light overhead gave off that same weak yellow hum. The meter gave me the same late drift on the line. The basement felt exactly the same as it had 10 minutes earlier, which somehow made it worse. I worked slower after that, not because I was scared enough to admit it, because I didn't want to give the place a rhythm if rhythm was what it wanted. I checked load again, traced the outgoing line as far as I could without moving deeper into the service side, and started narrowing down which branch was feeding the unstable section upstairs. That was when the light came on at the far end of the other corridor. Not the one above me. Not the one I was working under. Farther back, under the black pipe, a dim bulb woke up 3 seconds late and held there like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I stood there looking at that light under the black pipe longer than I should have. Not because I wanted to go that way, because the line I was tracing on the first panel map didn't make clean sense unless something downstream was feeding back through another section. That was the part that bothered me more than the light itself. A light coming on late was one thing. A branch acting like it was sharing load with lines that shouldn't have still been tied in was another. That was work. That was a real problem. The kind that made you go deeper, even when something else in your head was telling you to leave it alone. I pulled the service map closer and held my flashlight over it. The first panel fed the occupied wing through a run that split farther in. One branch was marked over in darker ink. Another had a note I still couldn't fully read because part of it had been smudged out years ago. I followed the conduit with my eyes, then with the flashlight, then with my actual hand along the cold metal exiting the panel. It ran overhead with the red pipe for a while, then crossed near the mouth of the darker corridor and disappeared deeper into the ceiling. That was the problem. I couldn't keep tracing the feed without getting close to the black pipe side. I took the meter, my flashlight, and the map, and moved slowly down the red pipe corridor. The farther I went, the lower the ceiling felt. The hum from the first light gave way to a thinner kind of quiet, the kind service spaces get when the house above them is still active, but too far overhead to feel connected to. I passed a shut-off wall, an old boiler line that had been capped, and another panel half hidden behind a shelf of forgotten paint cans and cracked storage bins. The conduit I needed turned where the red pipe corridor narrowed and the black pipe corridor opened off to my left. I meant to stay clear of it. I really did. But I was looking up at the run, not down at my feet, and by the time I realized the darker pipe was over me instead of off to the side, I was already one step too far in. That made me stop hard enough my bag bumped against my leg. For a second, I just stood there, annoyed at myself more than anything else. Then, Philip's voice from the top of the stairs came back to me in the exact tone he'd used, same as if he'd been pointing out a shutoff or a drain line. If you step into the corridor under the black pipe, close your eyes and step back 3 times before looking again. It felt stupid. It felt exactly like the kind of thing I'd make fun of if somebody told me they'd done it in any other context. I still did it. I closed my eyes. The air felt colder there. Not a dramatic cold, just less circulated. Old concrete holding damp. I took 1 step back, then another, then a third, counting them in my head and keeping my shoulders square so I wouldn't cheat it. When I opened my eyes again, the corridor in front of me looked almost the same. Almost. That was the problem. The turn back to the red pipe was where it should have been, and the panel light behind me was still glowing that weak yellow, but the distance between them felt off in a way I couldn't put numbers to. Like the black pipe corridor had stretched while my eyes were closed and then thought better of it. The angle of the ceiling looked flatter. The wall on my left seemed a little farther away than it had a second ago, not enough to call impossible, just enough that I stopped trusting my own sense of where I was standing. I swallowed, shifted back under the red pipe, and made myself keep moving. The second panel was older than the first, different manufacturer, older breakers, more handwritten relabeling. I set the flashlight on the floor so it threw light upward against the inside of the open door and started checking the outgoing lines one by one. 2 branches were carrying what I expected. One was weak in the same delayed way I'd already seen upstairs. Then I hit a line that should have been dead based on the map and got a low but real reading. I checked it again. Still there. That made me stop and look back at the schedule pasted to the inside of the panel door. Half the labels were original typed strips, half were later pencil notes. One branch had been crossed out so long ago the eraser marks had gone shiny in the paper. That was the one reading low, but live. I traced the outgoing conduit from that breaker and found it joining the same run as the unstable line before disappearing deeper into the ceiling, past a section of wall the current map marked as storage, and then nothing. No room name, no service designation, just blank space where something had either been removed from the plan or stopped mattering to whoever updated it last. I heard the knocking again then, not behind the panel this time, farther off, more spread out. I kept my hands moving because I needed another measurement before I changed anything, and because if I stopped every time the house made a noise, I was going to be down there till dark. 1 step to the side, clamp meter on the feeder, flashlight angle adjusted, note on the service tag. Knock. I shifted my weight and heard another one answer from farther down. That was when I realized it wasn't only following my hands now, it was picking up my steps. I tested it because I couldn't not. 1 step forward. After a beat, 1 knock, 2 slow steps back, 2 knocks, spaced wrong but close enough to make the skin along my arms tighten under the work shirt. I told myself it was the floor carrying through the pipe hangers, vibration through old supports, sound traveling sideways. I kept doing that thing people do when they know they're reaching and keep reaching anyway, because the other option is worse. The panel itself gave me something real to hold on to. Voltage drift. Weak carry on the unstable branch. Bleed or shared feed somewhere it shouldn't be. I leaned closer, following the lower row of breakers, and that was when I saw it. 1 breaker on the bottom left had no label at all. No empty strip where one had fallen off. No faded pencil line. Nothing. Just bare space where every other breaker had at least something next to it. I stared at it for maybe 2 seconds, and it gave a soft click. Not a trip, not a full drop. Just a click, like internal tension shifting. Every muscle in my shoulders locked. I backed my hand away from the panel and kept my eyes right on it. The unlabeled one just clicked, I told him. Philip came down faster than I expected. Keep your eyes on the panel, he said. I hadn't even heard him open the basement door. 1 second, I was alone with the weak yellow light and the hum in the panel, and the next I heard his shoes on the stairs coming down quick and controlled, not running exactly, but fast enough to tell me he had not been far away. I kept staring at the panel because suddenly I didn't want to do anything else. The unlabeled breaker clicked again. Somewhere behind me, from deeper in the basement, I heard footsteps cross the concrete. Not close, not far either. Just the sound of somebody walking past the open corridor behind my back at an easy pace, like they already knew where they were headed. I felt the instinct to turn so hard it almost hurt in my neck. I heard footsteps behind me. There's somebody down here, I said. Philip did not look back. No, he said. There isn't. He came up beside me, but not too close, and kept his eyes on the panel the same way I was keeping mine there. That was the part that changed something in me, not the words. The fact that he followed the rule exactly without needing to think about it. He wasn't humoring me. He wasn't acting out some old house ritual for effect. He was waiting something out. The clicking came once more. Then again, softer. Then it stopped. Neither of us moved right away. After the clicking stopped, he finally told me to move. Now keep going, he said. I turned and looked at him then because I couldn't help it. He looked older down there than he had upstairs. Not weaker, just more used up around the eyes. Like the basement took something out of him every time he came into it, and he'd stopped expecting that to change. I looked at him. You knew that was going to happen, I asked. He only gave me one line. I knew you were close enough to make it notice, he said. That sat with me while he went back toward the stairs, and I stayed with the panel. Close enough to make it notice. I didn't have room in my head yet for what exactly that meant, and I didn't want to make room for it. I wanted the job back. I wanted feeders, junctions, bad splices, overloaded branches, old maps, real things. So I gave myself that and went back to the work. I traced the unstable branch from the second panel as far as I could without opening walls. The line ran past the marked storage section and into a deeper service area the current panel map didn't name. That by itself wasn't impossible. Old estates got redone, sections got sealed, maps stopped matching. But when I checked an older paper schedule clipped behind the panel door, I found a faint earlier designation underneath the later notes. Not storage, not pantry. Something else had been there once. The writing was too faded to read fully, but it had been covered over, not erased. I followed the conduit with the flashlight to where it vanished past a cinder block partition and an old frame doorway that had been filled in years ago. The concrete was newer there than the surrounding wall, not fresh, just newer than everything around it. On the current map, that section was nothing. Blank space, no panel note, no room number, no service tag. And the unstable line upstairs was still carrying through it. That was when I understood the electrical problem wasn't just buried deeper than I liked. It was feeding through some part of the basement that didn't exist on the house plan anymore. I followed the conduit another 20 feet under the red pipe before it dipped toward a rusted junction box mounted close enough to the black pipe corridor that I had to angle my shoulders away from it just to get at the cover. The box was old, overpainted, and set into the wall right where the current map gave up, and the older system started acting like it still had its own ideas. I put my hand on the metal cover and felt the weak vibration of load moving through it. Not a lot. Just enough to tell me I was close. That should have helped. Instead, it made the whole place feel tighter. I set the flashlight on the floor, propped the old map against the wall, and worked one cover screw loose, then the next. The whole time I was aware of the darker corridor off to my left without looking straight into it. It sat there at the edge of my vision like an open doorway in a hospital at night. Nothing in it. Nothing moving. Still enough to take up too much room in my head. When the cover came free, I saw exactly what I'd been expecting and hated it anyway. One old splice had been wrapped and rewrapped over the years, the insulation dried and shrinking back. The newer feed tied into it looked better, but the whole thing was too close to damp masonry, and there was green corrosion starting on one connection that had no business carrying anything important anymore. It was the kind of fault that would absolutely give me delayed recovery upstairs. Weak carry, intermittent sag, enough contact to stay alive, not enough to stay stable. Something real. Finally. I almost felt better. I started checking each conductor, tracing which line was actually feeding the weak branch upstairs and which ones were just bleeding around it because old houses never really let anything die. I had one glove off again so I could feel what I was doing better, fingertips cold against the old wire jacket, and I was halfway through tightening a replacement connector when the sound changed. Not the knocking, the whole basement. It took me a second to understand what I was hearing, or not hearing. The faint drift of house noise from above, the soft traveling sounds you get through old framing and pipes and plaster, all of it thinned out at once like somebody had put a hand over the mouth of the building. Then I heard the door at the top of the stairs shut. It wasn't a slam, just the heavy close of old wood catching the frame. Every part of me wanted to drop what I had and go straight back. Then Philip's rule came back to me exactly the way the others had once I was down there and needed them. If the basement door closes on its own, finish the first panel task before going back to the stairs. It would have been easy to call that stupid right then and ignore it. It would have been even easier to tell myself I was only following it because the exposed splice was already open and I didn't want to leave it like that. That was probably half true. So I stayed where I was, forced my hands steady, and finished the connection I had already started. Cut back the bad section, cleaned the wire, set the new connector, tightened it down, rechecked the branch against the line I knew was feeding the weak wing upstairs. My shoulders were so tight by then they hurt. When the basement door shut above me, I heard my name from farther down. Xander. It wasn't loud. That was the part that got me. If it had come out of the dark like a shout, I could have hated it cleanly. Instead, it sounded close enough to be human and far enough to make me unsure what direction it had even come from. Not Philip's voice, not mine. Just my name said once, from deeper in the basement, somewhere beyond the filled-in wall and the dark corridor and whatever the current map had stopped admitting was there. I did not answer. I finished tightening the last connection because my hands had to do something. Then I put the cover back on the junction box with more force than I needed, took the meter reading again, and got a better number than I'd had 10 minutes earlier. Not perfect. Better. Enough that I knew I was standing on the real problem and not just circling it anymore. That should have been the point where I stayed calm and kept working. Instead, I started noticing everything else. The way the weak light over the corridor hummed a little louder after I stopped moving. The way I could hear my own breathing too clearly inside that section of the basement. The way the black pipe corridor felt like it had edged closer, even though I knew it hadn't. I told myself to get back to the first panel, verify the line, finish the rule, and get out. I told myself that over and over while I packed the tools back into the bag in the exact order I'd taken them out. Because if I rushed, I was going to drop something. And if I dropped something, I was going to have to reach for it in the dark. I kept to the red pipe all the way back. The first panel was where I'd left it. The delayed drift on the weak branch had tightened some. Still unstable, but less. I checked load one more time, confirmed the line was actually responding, and only then let myself turn toward the stairs. Nothing called my name again. Nothing had to. By the time I got back up into the service hall, my shirt was damp at the collar and between my shoulder blades, and my hands felt wrong. Not shaky exactly, just off, like I'd been using somebody else's for the last half hour and had only now gotten mine back. Philip was nowhere in sight. I didn't go looking for him. I cut straight through the hall, out the side entrance, and kept walking until I hit the gravel by the van. Cold daylight should have helped. Usually it does. You step out of a bad mechanical space, get air in your lungs, see the sky, and your head resets enough for the world to be normal again. It didn't, not right away. I opened the side door, shoved the tool bag in harder than I meant to, and stood there with one hand on the frame trying to decide if I was angry or just done. Probably both. There was a version of the rest of that day where I packed up, drove out of there, found a cheap room for the night, and took one more smaller job somewhere else before heading south. There was a version where I didn't let a basement and an old man with rules get into my head. Then I heard it. 2 faint knocks from somewhere along the van's side panel behind me. Light, hollow, easy to miss if I had still been moving. I froze and listened. Nothing after that. Just whined across the gravel and a branch touching another branch somewhere beyond the drive. That was enough. Philip came out through the same side door a few seconds later and stopped a few feet away, not crowding me, not acting like I was making a scene. Outside, I said it flat. "I'm done," I said. I meant it when I said it. I was tired. I was spooked in a way I did not want to name, and I had just spent too long in a basement that felt less trustworthy every minute I was in it. The line was real. The problem was real. But none of that meant I had to be the one still standing there when the rest of it decided it was finished pretending to be pipe noise and bad timing. Philip glanced toward my truck. "Finish it today and I'll add 2,000, he said. I did not answer right away. 2,000. That was the kind of number that changes the shape of a week when you've been doing the kind of math I'd been doing. That was gas, deposit cushion, enough room to stop taking the worst calls just to keep the plan alive. Enough to get to North Carolina and not arrive already behind. I hated how fast my brain did that calculation. I hated that it had been waiting for a number like that the whole time. Philip kept his voice even. "Mrs. Wren comes back in the morning. I need that line stable before then," he said. Still calm, still practical. He wasn't overselling it. That was part of why it worked. No speech about loyalty, no weird pressure, just money and a deadline and a job I already knew I was close to solving. Because I was close. That was the other ugly part. I'd found the bad junction. I'd already improved the reading. The problem wasn't imaginary. It lived in a real box on a real wall feeding a real section of the house. There were still things down there I couldn't explain, but the electrical fault itself had started showing me its shape. If I walked now, I'd leave money on the table and I'd be driving away from a job I was already halfway through. Men do stupid things for pride. They do worse things for almost enough money. I hated that I asked the next part. "Cash?" I asked. Philip gave one short nod. That was the moment I went back. Not because I wanted answers, not because I was brave, not because any part of me thought the basement would make more sense the longer I stayed in it. I went back because I needed the money, because I thought I was close enough to finish, and because I told myself the thing people always tell themselves right before they make a bad decision. Just one more trip down. I went back down with the cash part still sitting in my head, like something hot I couldn't swallow, right? That was the truth of it. I wish it had been something cleaner. Pride, professionalism. Some need to prove I wasn't rattled by an old basement and a set of rules that sounded insane when you said them out loud. But it was money. Money and a half-fixed line, and the fact that I was close enough to the end of the job to keep lying to myself about what the rest of it was going to cost me. The second trip down felt different before I even hit the lower landing. Same wet stone smell, same weak hum from the delayed light after I pulled the cord and waited for it to wake up, same red pipe overhead. But now I knew where the bad junction sat, and I knew how close it was to the black pipe side, and that changed the shape of everything. The red pipe side didn't feel safe anymore. It just felt less bad than the other side. I kept my bag lighter this time. Just what I needed to finish the repair properly. Cutters, fresh connectors, tape, meter, flashlight, no extra trips if I could help it. No reason to go back out to the van again. I told myself that twice. The first panel looked better than it had before. Not fixed. Better. The delayed sag was shorter. The weak branch upstairs had more hold in it. That should have made me feel good. Instead, it just told me I was in too deep to pretend this was still a normal call. I made my way back to the bad junction box and worked slower than I would have on any normal job. I checked the splice I'd cleaned up, then followed the remaining weakness farther along the feed and found another problem just beyond it, hidden in a section of conduit that disappeared past the filled-in doorway and came back through the wall lower down. Somebody had rerouted part of the run at some point and done it badly. There was another old connection in there, half hidden behind the newer work, corroded just enough to matter. That should have annoyed me. Usually it would have. Another lazy fix under an older fix under a problem nobody wanted to pay to solve the right way. But by then, I was too tired for straight annoyance. Everything in me had gone narrower than that. I got one knee down on the concrete and started opening the lower access plate. That was when I heard my tool case. Not a pipe, not the panel. The specific plastic rattle of my small socket case shifting the way it did in the van when I took a corner too fast. It came from somewhere farther down past the branch line, soft and familiar, and impossible enough that I stopped with the screwdriver still half turned in my hand. I listened. Nothing. Then, a few seconds later, I saw a strip of pale light where there shouldn't have been any. Not bright. Just a thin wash of it on the floor beyond the edge of the wall, the kind that looked like daylight slipping in under an exterior service door that hadn't shut all the way. It hit me fast because it made immediate practical sense. Old estates had lower delivery entries, side cellar access, utility doors that opened toward a drive or a garage lane. There could have been another way out of that basement. There probably had been at one point. And if there was, it would have been easier than walking back past the black corridor and the panels and the stairs I already hated. I caught myself leaning toward it, not moving yet, just leaning enough to feel where my weight wanted to go. That was the ugly part. It didn't need to promise me anything dramatic. It only had to sound like relief, my own tools, a slice of light, a way out that didn't involve turning my back on the place I had already let get too close. In the dark, off the branch line, I heard my own voice from somewhere farther in. Just finish it and go. I stood there longer than I should have, because that was already the sentence in my head. That was what I'd been telling myself since I took the cash deal outside. Finish it and go. Finish it and get out of New York. Finish it and get on the road. Finish it and maybe the next place feels like air again instead of this constant pressure in my chest every time I checked my account and did the math one more time. When you're tired enough, anything that sounds like a way out starts making sense for a second. You stop asking whether something makes sense. You just want it to be the exit. I got my hand back on the screwdriver by forcing myself to look at the actual work. Not the light, not the dark beyond the branch line. The real access plate in front of me, the real line carrying unstable load into the occupied wing, the real reason I'd been called there. Once I did that, the rest of it shifted a little, not gone, just less convincing. That strip of light didn't brighten or dim. It just sat there waiting for me to make it into a door. I pulled the access cover and found the second bad connection exactly where the feed path said it ought to be. That steadied me more than anything else had. Corrosion on one side, a sloppy tie-in on the other, enough weakness to keep the line alive and drag its feet every time the load changed. I set the flashlight against the wall and started cleaning it up. The sound of my tool case came again, farther off this time, then stopped. I didn't look. I cut the damaged section back, stripped fresh ends, and reset the connection with slower hands than I liked. Every time the basement made a noise, I made myself come back to the feel of the wire, the bite of the connector, the drag of the screwdriver against my palm. Real things. Small things. That was all I had. When Philip showed up at the upper landing again, he said only one thing. "If it starts sounding helpful, it's already too close," he said. I asked without looking at him, "How many times have you said that?" He let that sit there. "Enough," he said. That landed harder than if he'd tried to explain it. I finished the connection, checked the line, and watched the reading come back faster than it had before. Not perfect yet, but cleaner. Closer. The weak branch upstairs was starting to hold like a real line again, instead of something trying to remember how. The strip of light beyond the branch line was gone by then. Or maybe it had never been what I wanted it to be in the first place. I'd cleaned up enough of the line by then that the numbers were finally starting to behave like numbers again. Not good, just honest. I went back to the second panel with the old map and the newer service tag and laid them side by side on the concrete. One showed the active runs for the occupied side of the house. The other showed older routes, older designations, half-crossed-out notes from some version of Blackmir that didn't exist anymore unless you counted the basement. The unstable feed upstairs touched both. It started in the living part of the house, then dropped through the service side, then ran past that filled-in section, like whatever had been closed off down there still had to be included in the circuit, whether anyone admitted it on paper or not. That was what finally pushed me past weird old house and into something worse. Not because I saw anything new, because I stopped trying to keep the wrong things in separate boxes. The delayed light, the knocking in the pipes, the way it had matched my hands, then my steps, the way the black pipe corridor felt off even when it still looked mostly normal, the way Philip's rules all had the same shape once I stopped hearing them as individual warnings. They weren't about danger in the simple sense. They were about rhythm, sequence, response. Pull the light once. Don't do it twice. If it answers your hands, stop moving. If it calls your name, don't answer. If the breaker clicks, don't touch it. If you step into the wrong corridor, close your eyes and step back exactly 3 times. Not calm, not superstition, pattern. I went still with that thought and felt the whole basement get bigger and worse around it. The old service section beyond the filled-in doorway had not been cleanly removed from the system. That much I knew now. The house still fed through it in some way, or around it, or across it. The living part of Blackmir still depended on infrastructure running through a section no one used and no one marked anymore, which was stupid enough on its own. Rich people did that all the time with old properties. They built around things instead of through them. They stopped naming rooms and kept using the pipes. But that still didn't explain the unlabeled breaker. I went back to the second panel and looked down at the bottom left corner again. Everything around it was old but legible. Kitchen service, rear hall lights, boiler assist, crossed out, pump auxiliary, storage west. Then that one empty space beside the breaker with no name attached to it, like somebody had once decided even writing the wrong word down was worse than leaving it blank. I looked down at the unlabeled breaker. "That isn't feeding the house, is it?" I asked. Philip had come down again without me hearing the door this time. He stood a few feet back, not crowding me, hands at his sides, looking more like a man waiting out weather than a man talking about wiring. Philip stood still for a second. "Not the part anyone lives in," he said. I kept staring at the breaker. That was the piece that turned everything. Not the history of the place, not who had done what years ago, just that one practical truth. The unlabeled breaker belonged to a load that still existed electrically, but not to the house anyone used anymore. It fed something dead on paper and still live in the system. Or maybe not fed, held, separated, kept in relation to the rest of it in a way that mattered enough for Philip to build rules around. I heard myself say it before I had all of it straight. The rules weren't about staying calm, I said. Philip looked into the dark and not at me. No, he said. They were about not joining it. That hit me so clean I almost wished he'd lied. Joining it. Not fighting it, not escaping it, not provoking it. Joining it. The knocking matching my hand. The footstep rhythm. The delayed light that only came after I set the pace. The voice using the sentence already in my head. It had not been trying to scare me for the sake of it. It had been trying to get me to answer in the same language it was using. Same timing, same response, same circuit, if you want the ugly version of what I understood down there. The old system under the house had been doing more than carrying current. At some point, probably long before anybody alive in that house now, it had become part of a boundary. Not a wall, exactly. More like a way of keeping one section of the place in its own pattern, its own loop. And once I understood that, the rules made terrible, simple sense. You pull the light once because 2 pulls is a call and response. You don't answer knocking because answering is the point. You stop moving when it matches your hands because that's the moment it starts learning how your body works. You don't touch the unlabeled breaker because it doesn't belong to the occupied house. It belongs to whatever still keeps the old section from bleeding clean into the rest of the system. And if the basement door closes while you're inside, you finish the first task before leaving because leaving too fast makes you reactive, and reaction was what the whole place seemed built to use. I didn't need a name for it after that. I didn't want one. A name would have made it feel farther away, cleaner, more manageable. I just needed to understand it well enough to finish the job. The real electrical fault was still real. The corroded connections, the weak feed, the delayed recovery upstairs, all of that was ordinary enough. But it had stayed bad because it ran through something deeper that was already unstable for its own reasons. The line feeding the living wing crossed a dead section that should have been isolated better than it was, and whatever that section had become didn't like weak boundaries. Or maybe weak boundaries made it louder. I didn't need the exact version. I only needed enough to finish the job without giving it more of me. I asked the last thing that mattered. Then why keep this place running at all? Philip didn't look at me when he answered. Because when it goes dark all at once, it starts looking for another line, he said. That was answer enough. I stood there with that and looked back at the work. Not the black corridor, not the filled-in doorway. The actual work. The bad feed I'd already repaired twice still needed one clean isolation. There was one more section tying old unstable carry into the branch, feeding the occupied wing. If I cut that weakness out and rebalanced the line from the live side of the panel, the house upstairs would hold. That part was real, measurable. Something I could do with tools and time. The trick was going to be doing it without letting the basement set my rhythm again. I checked my watch. Late afternoon already. The light above the panel gave its weak hum. Somewhere behind the wall, water shifted once in the pipes and settled. I didn't answer it. I didn't move until it was done. Then I picked up my tools and got ready to finish what I'd come there to do. Once I knew what part of it was mine, I got back to the work. The bad feed was real. The corroded tie-in was real. The delayed recovery upstairs was real. My job was to isolate the failed section, bypass it from the cleaner side, and get the occupied wing onto something that would actually hold. The rest of the basement could do whatever it wanted, as long as I didn't let it set the pace. I laid my tools out on the floor in a tighter line than I normally would have, not because it helped the work, but because it gave me something to look at that wasn't the corridor behind me. Cutters, driver, tape, fresh connector, meter, flashlight. I kept my hands moving only when I meant to move them. Every time a pipe gave a hollow tick somewhere in the wall, I made myself stop first, breathe once, then start again on my own timing. The delayed light over the red pipe corridor dimmed once while I was opening the lower access plate, then brightened a second later. I didn't look up. I didn't let it set the pace. The basement had already shown me that was the game. Get me reacting, get me answering, get me moving with it instead of against it. So I worked smaller. I clipped the failing section loose from the old carry, tested the dead side, checked it again, then built the bypass from the cleaner run I'd already stabilized. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't how I would have wanted to do it in a house I trusted, but it was safe enough, honest enough, and most important, it kept the occupied wing from depending on the half-rotten path running through the sealed-off part of the basement. The knocking started up again when I was reseating the branch. Not loud, just close enough to be useful if I'd let it be. One beat after each turn of the screwdriver, then a little closer, then almost clean. I stopped, counted to 5, started again slower. It answered once from deeper in the wall, then again from somewhere farther off, like it was trying different distances to see which one I'd follow. I kept my eyes on the wire, on the screw head, on the meter. Real things, things I could measure. The unlabeled breaker clicked once while I was rebalancing load. I froze with the screwdriver still in my hand and waited it out. No second click, no drop. Just that one little sound from the corner of the panel where no label lived and no part of the occupied house belonged. I let my shoulders unlock one piece at a time and went back to work without touching it. The last step was the load test. That was the part that mattered. Repairs can look fine with nothing pulling on them. Houses don't live that way. They breathe under use, lights, wall outlets, kitchen service, small things stacking together. If the line was going to drift, that was when it would show me. I set the meter, brought the branch up, and watched the reading settle. The knock came back once behind me. Then the light farther off in the basement tried the same trick as before, waking up late where I couldn't see it directly. I caught the change at the edge of the wall and kept my focus where it belonged. On the last step of the repair, I said only one thing out loud. "Don't match it," I said. I tightened the final connection, checked the reading again, then again under added load. This time, the number held. No sag. No delayed recovery. No soft drift trying to come back in from the dead section. Just a clean enough carry to get power where it needed to go and keep it there. I stayed crouched for another few seconds anyway, staring at the meter because I didn't trust relief any more than I trusted the rest of that basement. Then I stood up, packed my tools, and walked the red pipe corridor back without once looking into the black one. Upstairs, the difference was obvious right away. The darker wing wasn't dark anymore. The hall sconces held steady. The chandelier in the dining room stayed clean and even. A lamp I'd tested earlier came on the second it should have and stayed on without that weak little hesitation that had bothered me from the start. The house still felt old and heavy, but at least the power was acting normal again. Philip stood in the doorway to the hall and watched the fixtures hold for a full half-minute before he said anything. When the load finally leveled out and the lights held, Philip looked at the restored line. "That will hold for tomorrow," he said. That was all either of us needed from it. He walked me back to the side entrance, disappeared into a smaller office off the service hall, and came back with a thick envelope in one hand. He didn't make a production out of it. No thanks, no apology, no mention of what had happened below. He handed me the envelope. "I paid what I said I would," he told me. I checked it in the van before I pulled away. I had to. Too many years of bad jobs and thin promises for anything else. The original amount was there. The extra $2,000 was there too. Real money. Enough that the numbers in my head shifted for the first time in months. Enough that when I drove out through the gate at Blackmir Estate, I knew I really was leaving New York. And I did. Not that night, but soon enough. I made it south, found a room first, then a smaller rental after that, got my name onto a couple of local call lists. Started picking up work that didn't come with gates and old service wings and men waiting beside basement doors with rules in their pockets. For a little while, it even felt like I'd done it right. Like maybe all I'd carried out of that place was money and a story I wasn't going to tell anybody. Then, the first clean job came in. Small panel replacement, drywall, newer construction. Bright afternoon, nothing old enough to blame. Weeks later in North Carolina, I tightened the second screw on a clean panel and heard 2 knocks answer me from inside the wall. I didn't turn around.